Good evening. Welcome to Wednesday night Bible study. Kind of cold and nasty weather out there tonight, so we don't have very many with us here in person, but hopefully you are joining us on Facebook Live. I do want to make mention to those who listen to this on podcast. We want to thank you for listening in on that. I hope you're enjoying that. I guess the benefit of that is that you don't have to look at my face, but you get to hear the Bible lesson. We're glad to have you here tonight. Do want to announce that next week we're going to begin a Bible study on the book of Joshua. I'm going to title that Catching the Conquering Spirit. So anyway, I'm excited about that Bible study for the book of Joshua, one of my favorite books in the Bible. Just love the character of Joshua, but also how that the Israelites were able to enter the promised land, conquer the promised land, set up there, and just begin to live the promised life that God had called for them. So I think that's very important for us to catch that same conquering spirit. That we're going to be in the book of Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. And we're going to talk about Moses, and in particular, God's call to Moses, and how does that relate to us, those who have a calling on their life. And I believe that almost everyone that is a Christian has some type of calling on their life. It may not be to minister the Word of God, may not be to preach or to teach, it may not be, some of those things that we see out front, but it may be a ministry of helps or something behind the scenes. But there's still a calling of God for us, each one of us in the house of God, because God didn't call us to just sit on the bench. He called us to be in the game, so to speak. So let's read the first 3 verses of Exodus chapter 3, and we'll get started. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn." And so we're looking at this. If you know the story of Moses, he's fled to the wilderness because he had killed an Egyptian trying to protect an Israelite. He was a Hebrew as well, but was raised in the house of Pharaoh. Anyway, from there, he was in the wilderness for 40 years, and we're getting near the end of his time in the wilderness, and he experiences something interesting. He's tending the flock, so he's working. And I think that does speak to us, because I don't believe that the Lord calls lazy people. I believe that God calls people who are working and willing to work and who have energy and passion to do something. So Moses was tending the flock for his father-in-law. And when you look at that, you see that here's Moses. Seems like he's just an obscure shepherd in the desert. And at this point in his life, he is so humble that he didn't even own a flock of sheep. It was his father-in-law's sheep. So we see that. And then he's on the Mount Horeb, which is also the same as Mount Sinai. And he brought his sheep to that mountain, and he looks and he sees something interesting. The bush was burning with fire, but it wasn't consumed. Now, in the desert, it's not uncommon for bushes to just ignite because it's so hot and so dry. So that wouldn't have been an anomaly, but that the bush didn't burn up caught Moses' attention. And so he sees that, and it wasn't being consumed. So this is kind of magnetic to him. He's being drawn to it for a closer examination. For the people of God, this bush may represent the people of God. It's possible because Israel was afflicted but yet not destroyed. And so there may be some symbolic things that are going on there. But what does it tell us about us? Number one, I believe that God will always reveal himself and his will to you. And that's one of the important things that we need to note, that God will reveal himself. In other words, he'll show us himself. He'll show us in his power and his glory, but he'll reveal himself. But not only that, he'll reveal his will to you. In other words, your mission, your call, that thing that God has for you to do. We look at this, we see that God revealed himself to Moses, and he's going to reveal his purpose or his plan for him as well. So let's read verses 4 through 6. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So notice that God did not speak to Moses until he got Moses' attention. And it's important for us that we give God our attention, because God really does want to speak to us, probably more than we want to listen. And he's always got something for us to do for his kingdom. So the bush was a spectacular phenomenon. It captures Moses' attention, but Moses wasn't really changed, or nothing changed until Moses received the word that God had for him. So it's important for us to receive the word of God. That's why we're here tonight. We're in a process of hearing and listening and hopefully receiving the word of God. Now notice that it says, Moses, Moses, the Lord said to him. This is showing us that even though Moses probably felt like just old shepherd, obscure in the desert by himself, that God had not forgotten him, that God was seeking after him, and that God knew who he was. He's a personal God. And it's very interesting, because anytime something is repeated, it shows to us that there's an importance or an urgency to it. So Moses, Moses, and there are several characters in the Bible that when God spoke to them, that he called them by their name twice. For instance, Saul, when Saul was on the way to Damascus and he was knocked from his animal by that great light and he was blinded, the Lord spoke to him and said, Saul, Saul. So it's important for us to understand that God has an urgent message for us, and that God thinks we're important. That's really what it's about. So how does that relate to our call, the calling on our life? We must be assured of our individual call. So this is not a call to the masses. This is a call to Moses individually. And when God calls you, he will call you individually. You may not hear his voice, but he'll place something in your heart or in your mind that honestly you just can't get rid of, and you can't get past it, and you need to listen to the Lord and be obedient to him. So look what God tells him. He says, don't draw near to this place. Now, why do you think he didn't want Moses to draw near? Moses may not have been ready. Good point, Pastor Jason. He may not have been ready, but also anytime God shows up in his power and his glory, then, we have to be cautious. God is a consuming fire, is what the Bible tells us. And so it was a holy place, is what God was telling him. Not only did he say, don't draw any closer, because remember, Moses kept getting closer and closer because he's looking at this bush and thinking, wow, this is weird. Then God began to speak to him and tell him, don't draw any closer. And maybe because he wasn't quite ready yet for that. The other thing that he told him was, take the sandals off your feet. That again emphasizes that this was holy ground, a holy place, but so shows a position of being humble. And God wanted Moses to be humble in his presence. In some countries, the poorest of the poor don't have shoes. And so they usually go barefoot. And in other countries, particularly Asian countries, when you enter into someone's home, they want you to take off their shoes. And so here, I believe that God was saying, hey, you're in my place. You're in, my house. Maybe not like the house of God, but God, his manifest presence was there. And God was like, don't come in with dirty shoes on. You're in my presence. And so he was respecting God. Pulling off his shoes was an emblem of laying aside all the worldly pollutions and walking away from sin. Really, when you take your shoes off, you don't really do that in front of strangers very often. So it's kind of an intimate thing. You're at home, you're comfortable, maybe not too comfortable, but because God, like I said, it's a holy place, but we do see that. So what do we see in this? Well, when it comes to a calling, I think one of the things we see is that if you'll listen, then God will give you direction. If you'll listen, God will give you directions. And I think that's important. We need to be listening for his call. So many times we get caught up in, God called me to do this, and he called me to go here, and he called me to go there, and we just take off like a rocket, and God didn't tell us what to do yet, or when to do it, or how to do it. So we need to make sure that we're waiting on God's directions. By declaring his relationship with the patriarchs of Israel. And what was this doing is that I believe it was reminding Moses that, hey, this is the same God that made a covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It's not a new God. It's the same God. And God hasn't forgotten. Wow, I think that's so powerful. Because I think during that 400 years that Israel was in slavery in Egypt, that it would have been very easy to just say, God has just abandoned us. God has left us. He no longer has a covenant with us. And, even just in a short time during the pandemic, I wonder how many people have thought, well, God, where are you at? Didn't you say you were going to do this or do that? And so it's important for us to know he's the same God. He's still at work. Sometimes it's behind the scenes, and we don't know what he's doing, but he is still at work. And then look at what Moses did. He shows extreme humbleness, hides his face because he's afraid to look upon the Lord. Only significant because Moses, prior to that, when he was in Egypt and he thought he was someone because he was in the house of Pharaoh, and he thought that he was going to go out and save his people just all by himself. And here we see that Moses has been humbled. He's no longer proud, and that he's responding to God in a totally different way. See, when we respond in humbleness to God and realize we need him, then we're in the right position to actually not only get a call of God, but to be able to accomplish it because we realize we need him more than anything. It's not in our abilities or our power, but it's in him that we can accomplish this. So let's look at the commission of Moses. In other words, God's calling him to do something, and he's going to talk to him about it. So let's read verses 7 through 10. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. That's a lot of ites, folks. Now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, here's the call. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so we see that God is explaining his general purpose and plan for Moses. And he tells him that I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and large land. God did not just then decide to give Israel the land of Canaan. It was the same land that he had promised to the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he's just renewing that covenant, and he's talking to Moses about that. What we see here is God sees when you're struggling. He sees the oppression of his people, and he wanted Moses to know, because he's going to go talk to the people of Israel, that God has compassion on you, that God has not forgot you. And I think that's important for us to note in times, honestly, we're not really at this point facing much persecution. Maybe it's starting, but God is compassionate, and he knows where we're at, and he does care about us. And it tells us there that he's going to send Moses to Pharaoh so that he can bring the people out. In verse 8, it says, God says, I have come down to deliver them. And then verse 10, it says, I'm going to send you. So which one of those is true? Both, right? If God said he would deliver them, why did he need to use Moses at all? This shows us that God chooses to use people, and he relies on human instruments. Really, the call of God here, when we see the call of God, you may be asking, Pastor, how do I know that this is the call of God? Well, one clue is that the call of God always centers around the needs of people. The call of God always centers around the needs of people. God sees the need, and God chooses to use you, especially if he's laid it on your heart, to minister to that need. Let's look at verses 11 and 12. Yes. It's very possible that he was like, well, God, hey, the children of Israel finally got your attention, and you're going to go down there and do it. And then all of a sudden God says, and I'm going to send you. That's very likely. Many times we get all up in arms when we see a need, and we think, God, why aren't you doing something about it? When all along he's laying that seed in your heart and in your mind to say, why don't you do something about that? I remember back before the Hispanic church was here, before Iglesia Peniel was in our building and using our building, and before all of that, I was in prayer, and I had been looking at statistics for this community and did not realize that there was as a significant a population of Hispanic folks in this community. And I just kind of said, And God said, and what are you going to do about that? And I immediately responded, well, God, you know that I don't speak Spanish. And I don't know that if I can even learn it, God. And so God began to lay a burden on my heart, because there were people in this community that needed a church and were in need. And while I'm not pastoring that church, we were able to help them to get a start. And very soon they've got their own building and going to be doing their own thing very soon, but they'll still be a part of us and have roots here. So, many times when we get that burden, it's because God's beginning a call in our life. So let's read, good question. Let's read verses 11 and 12. But Moses said to God, how many times do we say, but God? But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. I would say this very mountain, right? So what's the first thing that happens when Moses gets this call. And I think it's significant, and I think it is very common that as soon as God calls us, we're like, who, me? Who, me, God? Who am I? How can I do this? God, you know that I don't speak well, that I'm afraid of crowds. God, you know that, I'm just afraid to get in front of people, and I'm afraid to do this. And Moses began to make those kinds of excuses. Who am I? You see, 40 years prior, Moses really thought he was somebody. Essentially, he was a prince of Egypt. He was a Hebrew as well, part of God's chosen people. And after 40 years of chasing sheep around the desert, now Moses doesn't have quite that level of confidence. And honestly, the Lord didn't want him to have that level of confidence. He wanted him to have a humble spirit about him. What was God's reply? What did God say? Moses said, who am I? And God didn't say, well, you're this and you're that and you're here and you're there and you can do this. No, he said, I will certainly be with you. You see, why did God answer it that way? Because he intended to take Moses' eyes off of himself, his focus off of him, and put it on God. Really, we should never really ask the question, who am I? Instead, we need to say, who is God, right? He's here with me, and he'll certainly be with us. So God's identity was more important than who Moses was. And God's identity still is more important than who we are. I say it like this sometimes. If the call that God has put on your life doesn't frighten you, it might not be God. Now, that may not be true, but so many times God puts a call on our life that seems too big, impossible for us. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough supplies. But when we begin to look at the all-sufficient God and to look and get our focus on him, then it is possible for all things to come through him. Sure, God does know what we're capable of. Many times he knows it better than we do. I'll be honest with you. When the Lord first started dealing with me about becoming a minister and eventually becoming a pastor, I wasn't happy about it. I was content to lead worship, every once in a while teach a Sunday school class, and I was happy, and I was working a regular job at Sylvania and very content, growing family. Things were going well, and God upset my apple cart. But he saw more in me than I ever would have saw in me. So what do we see in all of this? One of the important things, and there's there's actually 7 or 8 statements, I think, that I see in this that talks about our call and leadership. And at this point, I want to say that God uses people, and that's the important thing, to minister to people and to carry out his will. He could have done it himself. Matter of fact, he told Moses, I'm going to do this, but then he said, I'm going to do it through you. And so God uses people to minister to people. And really, the problem that Moses had is he was a regular human, just like us. And he saw all of his insufficiencies. You see, God is greater. This is an important statement. God is greater than our insufficiencies. He's able to do, as his word says, exceedingly abundantly above all that we can ask or think, according to the power that lives in us. And so God's greater than our insufficiencies. He that is within us is greater than he that is in the world. How many knows that when God says something that he'll usually back it up with a testimony? So God testifies that, hey, Moses, this is so true and so clear that I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it through you, and I'm going to rescue the people of Israel. Just wait and see. When you get them out of Egypt, you're going to worship me on this very mountain that you stand on. And God did it. What an amazing, thing to wind up right back there. I'm sure to Moses, when he stood on Mount Sinai, that it was like, God, you said it and you did it, right? And it's just a testimony that God can do anything, and he chooses to do it through us. So Moses wasn't allowed to go in the promised land because of his disobedience, but he was able to worship the Lord and see God in all of his power and glory, and probably used by God more than anyone that we see in the whole Bible. We do see those things that he wasn't able to do, because none of us are perfect and don't fully obey all the time, but we're striving to do that. So let's look at verses 13 and 14 and 15, and we'll finish up here. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. One of the things that we see is Moses, in his calling, gets a revelation of God, especially a revelation of God's name. Moses knew that he was going to be in front of the children of Israel, so he's saying, God, what are your credentials? They're going to ask me, hey, who sent me? How did God reveal himself to you? And God said, I am who I am. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And when we look at that, it may not make sense to us initially. It may be like kind of a circular phrase, I am who I am. What does that mean? Yet it reveals something about God and his character. And what is it? That I am who I am. In other words, there's nobody that is equal to God. Nobody matches up to him. Nobody, if you were to write a mathematical equation and put God on one side and equals in the middle, the only thing that you could put in there is God. God equals God. Nothing else matches up to God. And so he says, I am who I am. And that it is I am who has sent you to the people of God. When we look at that phrase, that word I am, it tells us something about God, and that he's completely independent. He relies on no one else for existence. And it's also connected that God is eternal and unchanging. Because the word am, I am, it is not past tense or present tense or future tense. It is just there. I am, he says. And so God is eternal. God is unchanging. I am, in the sense that God becomes whatever is lacking in our time of need. So the name I am invites us to fill in the blank of whatever we need. When we're in darkness, Jesus says, I'm the light. When we are hungry, he says, I'm the bread of life. And when we are defenseless, he says, I am the good shepherd. The best news in all of this, and also important in considering of our calling, is just the phrase that God is with us. That's what he told Moses. I'm with you. Just to end on that statement tonight, to think about that no matter what God calls us to do, no matter how impossible it might seem, no matter how great the odds are against us, no matter what the circumstances around us look like, God is with us, and all things are possible with him. So I'm going to just kind of read these statements. If you were here, you would see them, and they would have blanks in them. But I'm going to at least read these statements that have to do with God's call on our life and our position of leadership. So, number one, God will reveal himself and his will to you. So that's important for us to note. Number two, we must be assured of our individual call. Not just a call in mass, but that God's calling us individually. Number three, God, when he calls you, will give you directions. Number four, the call of God always centers around the needs of people. Number five, and this is so important for us to remember, God uses people to minister to people and to carry out his will. He doesn't just poof and do it, although he can, but he chooses to use people to minister to people. Number six, God is greater than our insufficiencies. And then finally, what we ended with tonight is God is with us. Any further questions, comments? Appreciate those who are here being with me and making comments and listening in. And just want to say, for those who will be hearing this podcast later or listening to Facebook Live later, God bless you and keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, give you peace, stay healthy, stay warm and safe, and we'll see you soon. Pastor Jason, you have a comment or question? Yeah, we only captured a part of what God told him to do. There were many signs, and that kind of goes back to that God will give you directions. And Moses apparently knew the people of God very well, that they would want a sign and many signs. And Moses was able to do those signs. And so Jesus said to Thomas, you're blessed because you've seen, but more blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. And so hopefully we don't need a sign about everything, that we can trust God and have faith in him. Thank you for that comment. God bless you. You have a good evening.